This is Zephyr, and in this clip she cleans an entire room of Steel Path Grenier with just one shot. Oh yeah, and did I mention that she's pretty much completely invincible all at the same time? But even though Zephyr is obviously incredibly busted, she is somehow one of the least played Warframes in the entire game. So time to change that. As always, huge shout out to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let me show you what Zephyr can do with a proper build. And naturally, the first thing we're going to look at is, of course, her abilities that make her so strong. Starting out with her passive, which is already really nice. Zephyr gets reduced gravity, meaning she doesn't fall down as quickly, which you will instantly realize the moment you jump into a mission. But that's not so important. The real kicker here is that she gets plus 150% crit chance when she is in the air, meaning it's like you have 2 times point strike on your weapon. This is a huge crit boost, but alright, so much for the passive. Her first real ability is called Tailwind, and what it does is, if you tab it, you dash forward, and in case you hit an enemy, you do a bit of damage. This, in and of itself, isn't really useful, and also her jumping up and dive bombing down and all that stuff is complete nonsense. However, one thing that this ability also can do, which might be a bit more useful, is if you activate it mid-air by holding down the ability button, then you change into a sort of hover mode. This continuously drains energy over time and keeps you in the air constantly. That is a great synergy with her passive, which gives you, as we remember, plus 150% crit chance whenever you're in the air. This skill also comes with an augment, however, this is not really useful, so let's just save some time and not really talk about it. Ability number 2 goes by the name Airburst, and this one is really useful. What this does is it makes Zephyr throw a sort of air projectile, and once this projectile hits a surface, it does one of 2 things. If you held down the ability button to throw it, then it will push nearby enemies out of the way. However, if you just push the ability button normally, it will suck in nearby enemies. And even though it does not have the crazy range that some other grouping abilities bring to the table, it is still a very useful crowd control ability, and Zephyr can make great use of it. Now, this ability also got an augment mod, and this one is actually really interesting. Airburst rounds makes that every enemy which is hit by this airburst, like by the grouping ability, increases the base damage of secondary weapons. This whole damage bonus is capped at 500%, and you will reach those 500% really quickly. However, even though this sounds all great, I still think that this augment mod is really situational. Because while there are surely great secondary weapons, I kind of have a feeling that the most optimal weapons for Zephyr, and we're going to talk about them here in a minute, are still going to be primary weapons, therefore not benefiting from this mod. Skill number 3, Turbulence. This one is absolutely amazing, and the reason why Zephyr doesn't even need to be afraid of level 10,000 enemies, because it kinda keeps her just invincible. What it does is it makes Zephyr create a sort of windshield around herself, which redirects incoming fire. Now, incoming fire in this case refers to pretty much everything that comes out of any type of gun. Lasers, bullets, arrows, and even rockets will be redirected by this and not hit you. However, this ability still does not protect you from melee attacks and does not protect you from any sort of AoE damage like gas clouds or explosions. But this ability has a range, meaning if the range is high enough, not only will you not get hit, but everything that is close enough to you will also not be hit by any enemy fire. This means that Zephyr is maybe one of the, or even the best solo defense, mobile defense, or excavation frame, because you can just simply stand on the defense target and all the enemies around you cannot do a single thing. Which leaves us with only one more ability, and that would be her 4, named Tornado. What it does is it creates 3 tornadoes that either move around in the vicinity if you tap the button, or are stationary if you hold it while casting. When enemies get close to the tornado, they get sucked in, elevated, and then they're trapped in the tornado. They cannot attack, they cannot do anything, and this is the big kicker, if you deal damage to the tornado or status effects to the tornado, then the damage and the status effects that you apply to the tornado will be reflected onto all the enemies that are currently trapped in the tornado. Also, crit damage that you deal to the tornado is doubled again before being applied to the enemies. Now, just like all the other skills, also Tornadoes has an augment, and this one is pretty interesting because it makes that instead of having 3 big tornadoes, you have way more smaller tornadoes, which therefore are not able to trap and elevate enemies and can just redirect your damage to them. Can be really nice, but I personally still prefer the 3 big tornadoes, so we're not going to use this augment for the build today. Also, I would be super happy if you could maybe spare a like, helps the channel out a lot, so big time thank you. Alright, now that we know what Zephyr can do, the next logical step would be, of course, jumping into the build and talking about the modding. And we will do that here in a second. However, before we jump into the build itself, it is vitally important that we know how we actually want to play this build and how it's working in practice, because otherwise you're just not going to understand why we use the mods that we actually end up using. So let's look at that first. The way this Zephyr build is going to be played is we're going to have our 3 on all the time so we don't get hit by any incoming fire. That is pretty straightforward. Then we cast our tornado at the stationary position and use our second skill to group up all the enemies, pull them all into the big tornado so we have a big blob of enemies elevated in the middle, and then we can start dealing damage not to the enemies but to the tornadoes, and that damage will then be reflected to all the enemies, which leads to this crazy high kill count all at the same time that you see in the background footage throughout the video. If you want, you can also use her one to be in the air while you hit the tornado to get that more crit chance, but you could use this one and replace it with something from the helmet. But we're going to talk about that here in a second. Now, the really important part that we need to talk about here is how we're actually going to deal the damage to the enemies in the tornado. Instead of dealing direct damage to the enemy, we are going to inflict a ton, and when I say a ton, I mean a ton of damage over time causing status effects, those being either slash, heat, toxin, or electricity. So, long story short, what we need is a weapon that has both a very high status chance and ideally a very high fire rate, all while at the same time having either heat, electricity, toxin, or slash as their predominant damage type to make sure that this is also going to be the status effect that we're inflicting most of the time. And then we can use this weapon to attack not the enemies, but the tornado with it, meaning that every individual enemy in the tornado will be inflicted with tens and maybe even hundreds of these damage over time status effects, and all of them falling dead at the same time. Now, the logical question now would be, which weapons do you want to choose in order to make sure that the enemies are dying as quickly as possible? Against every enemy in the game that doesn't have any shields, so pretty much everything except Corpus, the best damage over time effect by far is slash and the accompanying bleed effects. And in my personal opinion, one of the best slasher weapons in the game, completely underrated if you ask me, would be the Convectrix or alternatively the Tenet Flux Rifle. Especially the Convectrix with the build that you see in the background right here is so unbelievably crazy when it comes to the slashes that it yields. If you don't have the Convectrix, you need to get it in your arsenal. Another option for enemies that don't have shields would be heat instead of slash. It's not as optimal, but it's also still very strong. And if you want to go for that, then you might have already guessed it. The Ignis Wraith is always a solid option, but the Phantasma or Phantasma Prime, if you mod them for heat and fire rate, then that's definitely also very strong. But now, what about Corpus? As we know, the best element by far against Corpus is pure Toxin because it ignores their shield and goes to their health directly. And as unconventional as my choice in this case would be, I would recommend just trying out this little secondary called the Embolist. It ticks all the boxes, is really crazy against Corpus, and since it is a secondary weapon, we can also use the Airburst Rounds Augment, which increases the base damage of secondary weapons if we're going against Corpus with the Embolist. Now, one last word before we jump into the build. Since we're going for damage over time, it is very important that every weapon build that you use has a faction damage mod installed on it, because faction damage, due to the math that goes on in the background, is so strong and so busted in practice that you should not go without it on these weapon builds here. But alright, let's finally look into how we're gonna mod the Warframe itself. Now, when we talk about modding, the first question we naturally always ask is, how do we keep the Warframe alive? Which mods do we use for survival? And for Zephyr, this is actually very simple, none at all, because we have our third skill that keeps us alive, so no survivability mods needed. Then, the next question would be, what do her skills need in terms of duration, efficiency, range, and strength? So let's look at that now. As we described in the previous gameplay section, what we want to do is pull the enemies in with her 2 and have them in the tornado with her 4. So naturally, what we want to make sure is that those skills are on as long as possible, so we don't have to recast them as often. That means duration is definitely going to be a priority on this build. But not only that, because since we want to use the skill to pull the enemies in, it is also very beneficial to have a lot of range. These two are going to be our build priorities for the entire Warframe. So what we're going to do is overextend it for a big time 90% ability range, then stretch, augur reach, and also cunning drift if you want to use the XLO slot for even more ability range, pumping that up to the absolute maximum. Next, we look into duration with Prime continuity, or if you don't have the Prime version, normal continuity, narrow-minded, which gives us big time duration but costs us ability range, however this is no problem because we have so much of it, and finally either Constitution or Augur Message for even more duration. Which one of these two you use is pretty much up to personal preference. Then, to make sure we always have enough energy, we use Flow, or if you have Prime Flow, to expand our maximum energy pool, and that would be it for the main part of the build. Now, as we talk about the aura, I personally used Aerodynamic, but only for the reason that it had the right polarity to fit into this slot. In reality, since you have your third skill, the reduce damage when mid-air does not apply anyway, since you don't take damage at all. Instead, if you want to go for a more optimized aura mod, then I would recommend something that boosts the damage of the weapon that you use to attack the enemies, since the weapon with Zephyr is going to be your main source of damage, and the right aura mod can help with dishing out even more. So much for the mods. Let's now look into arcanes, where I personally went for Arcane Energize to make sure that I always have enough energy, but if you don't have it, then you do not need to use it. You could also use like Equilibrium in your build to make sure that you get your energy this way. And this, right here, would be the basically finished build from my part. Now, you do notice there is one open mod slot as well as one open arcane slot. And don't worry, in contrast to the Valkyrie build, I'm gonna tell you right away and not let you wait till the end of the video. This open mod slot is absolutely personal preference and comes very much down to what build and what setup you're actually running. For example, as I just said, if you don't have Arcane Energize, you might want to use it for Equilibrium and secure your energy this way. Or if you use the Embolist as a secondary weapon against Corpus, as we previously mentioned, you would use this mod slot for the Airburst Round Augment mod, or maybe an Augment mod for a Helminth skill that you want to use. And if you decide to go for a heat weapon, Archon Vitality is also a very smart choice for this, because it doubles the amount of heat status effects that you're dealing. As for the second arcane slot, this is also kind of personal preference, but I have a strong recommendation here, and that would be either Arcane Acceleration, Arcane Tempo, or Arcane Velocity, depending on whether you want to go for rifles, shotguns, or pistols as your main sort of damage. These three arcanes do basically the same thing. Whenever you deal a crit, you have a very high chance that the specific weapon type that this arcane refers to gets a massive boost in fire rate. And as we pointed out earlier, what you want to have is a high status chance weapon with as much fire rate as possible. Now, so much for the build. But since we all know Helminth does exist, so let's also talk about some valid Helminth options for Zephyr. And the great thing is, her kit itself basically has everything she needs, so you're very much free to let your own creativity flow. Since we're going for damage over time, Rhino's Roar is naturally always a great option to amp up your damage output even further. However, since the build that we have costs you a lot of strength and we're sitting only at 40% strength, this would be hurting your roar, so if you decide to go for that, you might want to switch out some mods to make sure that you have at least a bit of strength. Also, one very strong and busted idea, and the KnightmareFrame I think also has done a video on this very recently, is to use Hydroid's skill, where he does this rain field and applies corrosive and with the augment, also viral status effects to the enemies. This is huge if you cast it on the same spot as your tornado, because then those raindrops are going to inflict the status effects to the tornado. That is going to reflect that onto all the enemies inside, and it's just going to be a firework of status effects and death and pain and destruction. It's just so good, so I definitely urge you to check this one out for yourself, or just very simply, if the acolytes that visit you in Steel Path on a regular basis bother you, then you can of course also always go for Banshee's Silence to shut them up and deal with them before they can do anything to you. But what are your personal preferences? Let me know in the comments down below, so maybe I have some more ideas to try out for myself. And finally, whoever says Helminth also needs to say Archon Shards. So, which Archon Shards does Zephyr want? Well, good news is, actually none at all. She works perfectly fine even without any shards. There's nothing we need to fix here. However, if you feel you need a bit more energy or you want to swap out your flow mod for something else, then Archon Shards for more maximum energy always work, as well as if you have a Helminth ability that needs strength, then you can naturally also use some red Archon Shards to give you more of that. And just by the way, if you're still listening, then you might also want to think about maybe leaving a sub so you don't miss out on any future broken guides. And while you're doing that, let's also take a look at Zephyr's companions, which are actually really important for this whole setup to work. Now, since the update, a lot of companions have become very viable. But for this very specific Zephyr setup, there are two that work exceptionally well. Those being the Sentinel Diriga, as well as the Sisters of Pavo's Hound. Let's look into them. Diriga is one of the most meta Sentinels in the game right now. Basically, what it boils down to is you use the Sentinel to do the status priming for you so you don't have to switch any weapons. In order to do that, you go to Diriga and put the mod Arc Coil onto him. This makes him zap the enemies with electric lightnings. Then you're going to use one of the new mods, Manifold Bond, which makes that all the different status types that are on the Sentinel's weapon will also be dealt to the enemy whenever the companion zaps them. This is already doing a great deal of status priming. And then you also couple that with Momentous Bond, which gives you even more different elements if you kill Exima's units. This makes Diriga a great passive status primer. You just need to position yourself in a way that Diriga, when he zaps the enemies, actually hits the tornadoes as well, so the status effects are applied to all the enemies in the tornado. But even though Diriga is a very good companion for Zephyr, the top spot, in my personal opinion, would be the Sisters of Pavo's Hound, and I'm also going to tell you exactly why. Just like Diriga, the Sisters of Pavo's Hound uses Manifold Bond as well as Momentous Bond to do the status priming for you. In order to make sure this works, you need to equip the Hound with the mod Synergized Prospectus, which makes that the Hound shoots out an electric bolt that is gonna dangle between the enemies and apply all the status. So pretty much the same that Diriga does with the electric zaps, just in another visual form. However, what makes the Hound even better is the mod Repo Audit that is also exclusive to Hounds and emits a quite large magnetic pulse that completely disarms enemies as well as inflicts magnetic status effects, so even more status priming as well as enemy disarming. And as if that's not enough, I want to quickly get back to what I said in the weapon section earlier, that if you run a weapon that wants to have a very high fire rate, then the Hound has another great ace up its sleeve, and that would be the mod Reinforced Bond. Due to the fact that Hounds have naturally a pretty high base shield, if you mod a bit of shield onto them, they will have more than 1200 max shields. This enables you to use Reinforced Bond, which gives you even more fire rate for your weapons just because the Hound is there. Now, if all this sounds very nice and intriguing to you and you want to go and shop the look and get your hands on this setup for yourself, then you might be asking yourself, where do you obtain the Warframe and the companions? So let's talk about that for a second. Zephyr herself is actually really straightforward to get. The main blueprint as well as her components for the normal version of her, you can get them from the Tenno Lab in your clan's dojo. However, if you're not in a clan or you simply want to step up the game and get the Prime version right off the bat, then unfortunately her Prime is currently vaulted, but luckily it's very cheap and you can get it for even under 70 plat on Warframe.market on PC, so you'll definitely not have to ask Fraud back for a loan. Then, the Diriga Sentinel is very simple. You just go to the market, buy the blueprint, craft him, and done. As for the Hound, well, this one might be a bit more complicated because the only way to get Hounds is by hunting down Sisters of Pavos, which is a lengthier process, and unfortunately, since the mods that you get with the Hound once you have one are depending on which body parts the Hound consists of, it might just be that in order to get Repo Audit and Synergized Prospectus, you have to go and continue farming more Hounds or trade them with other players. Now stop! Before you end the video, there is one more chapter to come, because over the time, more and more of you continue asking me about the fashion that I showcase in my videos. So I decided for every future Warframe guide, I'm also going to have a little section at the end where I showcase the look of the frame from the video. And for this Zephyr, it goes as follows. I'm running both the Harrier skin and helmet. I have no attachments on her except the shield leg plates, which give her this nice corpusy techie look. Then I combine that with the Serrator Syandana from Hildren, you can also use the Prime version if you have that, and everything then is colored in blues and purples from the Eminence palette, as well as whites and grays from the Smoke palette. However, if you don't have these specific palettes, you can just substitute with whatever you have in your personal arsenal. Now, if annihilating the entire room is great fun for you, then you might also want to go and check out this disgustingly broken, hundreds of millions of damage Valkyr build right here. Also, another massive thank you to Akimbo Fate, Niels V, Lamies, Demon Lord Cell, Disorder Demon, Bland Waffle, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.